So most theories of international trade did not consider transportation cost as a cost of cost of production of a commodity. So many theories were developed with the assumption of no transportation cost, and the role of transportation cost in affecting the comparative advantage of the nations on certain commodities, on the particular commodities, has been completely neglected by the trade theories in general. But we know transportation cost is a reality. It is an unavoidable cost of a commodity. It has to be added to the cost of production of a commodity. So let's look how does the transportation cost affect the international trade. So before getting into the lesson, this is remind you, this is the partial equilibrium analysis of transportation cost and international trade. Here we analyze how does the transportation cost of a commodity will influence the international trade, and how does it affect the foreign demand of the domestic commodity. Then what impact will it make on international trade. So as I said, most of the theories or the trade theories in general assumed that there will be no transportation cost. If the transportation cost is assumed to be prevalent, assumed to be existing, then they have to explain how does it affect the comparative advantage of the nations on producing commodities. So look at any theory of international trade in general, starting from absolute classical theory of trade to the Linder's theory of trade. So all these theories have assumed that there is no transportation cost in existence, and there are so many bases of trade we have learned: absolute advantage, comparative advantage, factor endowment is the specific base of trade affecting the comparative advantage, differences in opportunity cost, dynamic technological changes or innovation and imitation, product differentiation for the intra-industry trade, availability of goods according to Kravis, similar demand structure affect the international trade according to Linder. And here we have a transportation cost. How does the transportation cost of a commodity affect the international trade? How does it affect the foreign demand of the domestic commodity? Let's look. So transportation cost, as I said, is an unavoidable cost of a commodity. So it exists in the form of various form of freight charges. That the transportation cost may be freight charges, transportation cost may be warehousing cost, that is the cost for keeping the commodities in godown warehouses. That may be the cost of loading and unloading the commodities. It is also transportation cost. Insurance premium paid for the import and export of the commodity is also part of the transportation cost. Interest charges paid on the loans taken by the importers or exporters of the commodity is also part of transportation cost. All these have to be added to the cost of production. So why do we consider transportation cost? The answer is simple. It is a reality. It is an unavoidable cost of a commodity, and it affects the comparative advantage of the nations on producing the commodity. So this is an important factor driving international trade. We have many untraded or rarely traded or less traded commodities and services. Look at the examples. Hair cutting is such a non-traded or rarely traded service. So for getting our hair cut, we will not travel to the United States, as the price of hair cutting is much less than the transportation cost for going to the United States for getting our hair cut. Similarly, vehicle repairing. For getting our vehicles repaired, we will not travel to the foreign nation, as vehicle repairing is so simple, it is possible, it can be done in the hometown. So for traveling, for bringing our vehicles to the foreign country uh, is not feasible, as the transportation cost is much bigger. Similarly, the commodities like bucket, cement, furnitures, all these are bulky commodities. So bulkiness of the commodity will affect the trade of the commodity. If the commodity is much bulky, the commodity is less likely to be traded. When the commodities are not bulky or less bulky, the commodity is more likely to be traded. For example, the case of bucket, the value and weight of we have to consider the value of the bucket and weight of the bucket. When the weight to value ratio is high, the commodity is bulky. Consider the case of cement. Cement is also a bulky commodity, and it is also a less traded commodity. Furnitures are also like that. Furnitures, all these are non-traded or less traded. These are not absolutely non-traded commodities, as domestic trade is possible for the trade of bucket, for the trade of cement, for the trade of furnitures, and even the foreign trade between two neighboring nations in a smaller volume may also be possible for the trade of bulky commodities, as the trade between India and Bangladesh has been taking place on the import and export of cement. So it's a rare case, but in general, the bulky commodities are less traded or rarely traded or non-traded. So why these are untraded or less traded? These are untraded or these are less traded as its high weight to value ratio is very high. As the weight of the commodity increases without any change in value, or with less than proportionate increase in value, the ratio will be higher. The commodity is highly bulky. So this is the reason for the lack of trade of bulky commodity. And consider the case of mobile phone. Mobile phone is not a bulky commodity compared to cement and furniture, because the weight to value ratio is not higher. For example, normally the smartphones are priced over 10,000 or around 15,000, 20,000. There are so many phones above 20,000 per mobile phone, but its weight is so silly compared to cement and furniture. So it is highly traded commodity, and the price of traded commodities are determined generally by the domestic demand and domestic supply. And similarly, the traded commodities are determined generally by the world demand and world supply of the commodities. Having said that, these days many non-traded commodities have become traded commodities, and it is the thanks to the development in the technology. Technology has fueled the trade of such commodities. For example, the invention of invention of aircraft has fueled the trade of fruits, vegetables, and emergency medicines from one country to another country. So this has facilitated with the invention of airplane or aircraft. Along with that, the invention of refrigerated trucks also enabled the trade of perishable commodities like fruits and vegetables. So the trade has increased these days thanks to the technology, thanks to the technological changes. So the faster transportation is possible these days with the invention of various technologies, with the invention of the invention in the transportation industry. The longer storage is also possible with the invention of refrigerator. So the technology has reduced the transportation cost and spoilage of the commodities, of the perishable commodities. So let's look the partial equilibrium analysis of transportation cost and international trade. So how does transportation cost affect the international trade and foreign demand and domestic demand of the commodity? So here we have two nations and one commodity. Two nations are nation 1 and nation 2. One commodity is commodity X. So this X commodity X is being produced in both nations, nation 1 and nation 2. This is the case before international trade. So before international trade or in the absence of international trade, both nations produce 50 units of commodity X, 50 units of commodity X at different price in both nations. In nation 1, nation 1 produces 50 units of commodity X at the per unit price of $5 per one commodity, one X. That is the point of equilibrium before the international trade takes place. As the supply curve and domestic supply curve and domestic demand curve are intersecting each other at point E. This is the case in the absence of international trade. At the same time, in the absence of international trade, in nation 2, 50 units of commodity X is produced by nation 2 in nation 2 at the per unit price of $11 per commodity X. So the price of commodity X in nation 1 is much lower than that of nation 2. So here export starts from nation 1 to nation 2, as the price of the commodity X is much lower in nation 1 and much higher in nation 2. So usually the trade takes place, the export takes place from nation 1 to nation 2. Suppose the transportation cost is $2 per commodity, $2 per unit of the commodity X. So that means in nation 1, price of the commodity X will become $7. So as the export takes place from nation 1 to nation 2, price of the commodity in nation 1 itself increases from $5 per unit of the commodity X to $7 per unit of the commodity. So this is the price level after international trade in nation 1. Usually the price of the commodity in nation 2, price of the commodity X in nation 2 will fall from from $11 per unit of commodity X to $9 per unit of the commodity X, as the $7 is the price of the commodity in nation 1 after international trade. Before international trade it was $5 per unit, and after international trade it is $7 per unit of the commodity. So $7 plus $2 per unit of the commodity, that means $9 will be the price of the commodity after international trade in nation 2, as nation 2 imports commodities from nation 1 at $7 per commodity, plus they have to pay the transportation cost. Transportation cost is supposed to be $2 per commodity, then 7 plus 2 is 9. $9 is the unit price of the commodity per commodity X, per unit price of the commodity X. So at the price 7 in nation 1, the look at the supply curve and demand curve. Supply curve is XX, domestic supply curve is SX, domestic demand curve is DX in both nations. Look at the supply and demand curves of nation 1 at $7 per unit of the commodity X. At $7, demand curve is 30, supply curve is at 70. That means domestic production is 70x at $7, but domestic consumption is, that means domestic demand or domestic consumption is 30 units of X at $7 at the rate of $7. The rest 40 will be exported. The rest 40x will be exported to nation 2. So the nation 1's export is considered as nation 2's import. Look at the demand and supply curve of nation 2 at price $9 per unit, because after international trade, price of the commodity X in nation 2 is 9 and nation 1 is 7. The extra $2 is transportation cost per commodity. So total price is $9 in nation 2. So at 9, the demand curve is the greater than supply curve. As you can see, demand curve or domestic consumption will be 70 units of X, but domestic supply is less than that of the previous situation. In the previous situation, the price was higher. As price comes down, supply also comes down as per the law of supply. So at $9 per unit of the commodity X, 30 is the domestic production, but 70 is the domestic consumption. So the rest, the gap is excess demand is for 40. That 40 units of X is imported from nation 1, where the price is lower than that of nation 2. So by the virtue of international trade, nation 2 was able to reduce the price of commodity X, even though the transportation cost is positive. So now assume there is no transportation cost, but trade is taking place, but there is no transportation cost. Then the price will be at $8 per unit of the commodities. When there is no transportation cost, the international trade will be supposed to be fair. There will be free trade, as there is no other obstacles are found. No obstacles are considered. There is no transportation cost. So in the absence of transportation cost, the free trade will enable the equilibrium prices, equal prices of the commodities in both nations. This is due to international trade. So in the absence of transportation cost, the prices will be at $8 per unit of the commodity X in nation 1 as well as in nation 2. So at $8 per unit of the commodity X, the domestic demand of the commodity X in nation 1 will come down to 20 units of commodity X, and supply will increase to 80 units of commodity X. So the excess production is of 60 units of commodity X. That 60 units of commodity X will be normally exported to nation 2, as there are two nations. We are assuming there are two nations, and the excess production will be supplied, exported to the other nation. And look at the demand and supply conditions of nation 2 at price of $8 per unit of the commodity X. The domestic demand is 80. Domestic supply in nation 2 is 20. Then 80 minus 20 is 60. This is the excess demand for commodity X. That excess demand will be met by the import from nation 1. This is the case of international trade without transportation cost, and with transportation cost, the price will be different in two nations. In nation 1, that will be $7 per unit of the commodity after international trade, and it will be $9 per unit of the commodity in nation 2 after international trade. So that $9 is equal to $7 is the cost of production in nation 1 plus $2 per unit of transportation cost. The totally $9 will be the price of commodity per unit price of commodity X in nation 2 after international trade with transportation cost. So this is the way in which transportation cost is going to affect the international trade, going to affect the domestic demand and supply, foreign demand and supply, and this is the partial equilibrium analysis of transportation cost and international trade.